Please welcome Bill Fetter, a good friend and a tremendous speaker. Okay. That's it. Backhanded.
Charlie has so much energy, and I am in awe. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you for letting the Lord use you to help save our country. And I have some books on the table, and I'm just going to jump into my talk, and it's on socialism. But before I do, I have some slides on the election in Texas. My computer will wake up here. Like that. Looks like it's sort of frozen. Oh, there we go. I've been doing this long enough to have all kinds of stories. My computer wanting to do an update right when they introduce me. And it like freezes, and it's like, so that's the new book, Socialism, The Real History from Plato to the Present, and then the subtitle is How the Deep State Capitalizes on Crises to Consolidate Control. So before we get into that, 1948, Lyndon Baines Johnson running for Democrat primary for the U.S. Senate against Democrat Texas Governor Coke Stevenson. And Coke Stevenson is more popular, and he would have won, but mysteriously, on election night, a box of uncounted ballots was discovered in the South Texas town of Alice in Jim Wells County. It's precinct number 13. Just happens to be LBJ's hometown area. And confusion reigns. And at the end of the week, LBJ won by 87 votes. And FBI, Postal Department, other agencies investigating and piecing it together, the details of the story emerges that the tabulation period, LBJ's campaign manager, John B. Connolly, traveled to Alice, Texas, to Jim Wells County, and helped out. George Parr was the Duke of Duval, the wealthy political boss of Jim Wells County, and he gave Connolly access to be present when the ballots were counted and the returns amended. George Parr later committed suicide, and well, when the dust settles, the newly recounted ballots showed 202 additional voters, some of whom were deceased and buried in the local cemetery or absent from the county on election day. These voters had lined up in alphabetical order at the last minute, signed in the same blue ink, in the same handwriting, and they all cast their ballots for LBJ. 30 years later, the New York Times runs an article. Ex-official says he stole 1948 election for Johnson. And so the disclosures made by Louis Salas, who was the election judge for Jim Wells County Box 13, which produced just enough votes for the 1948 Texas Democrat primary runoff to give Johnson the nomination. And there he is posing with the box. Johnson did not win the election. It was stolen from him. I know exactly how it was done, said Mr. Salas, now lean, white-haired 76-year-old. George P. Parr, the South Texas political leader, whom Mr. Salas served a decade, shot and killed himself, and then Mr. Johnson was dead. So Mr. Salas decided he wanted to break his silence in quest for peace of mind. I was just going along with my party, he said. Mr. Parr ordered that 200-odd votes be added to Mr. Johnson's total from Box 13. Mr. Salas said he had seen the fraudulent votes, added them in alphabetical order, and had them certified, then as authentic on orders from Mr. Parr. Parr was the godfather. He could tell any election judge, give us 80% of the vote and the other guy 20%. We had it made in every election. The New York Times continued the article. The Associated Press interviewed a former agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, T. Kellis Debrell. Mr. Debrell said also the last 202 names were made in the same colored ink and the same handwriting, whereas the earlier names in the poll list were written by different individuals in different color inks. The final statewide count, including Box 13, gave Mr. Johnson an 87-vote margin, earning him the tongue-in-cheek nickname Landslide Lyndon. So it wasn't a landslide, but they said, sort of making fun that it was really close, and the Democrat Central Committee was deadlocked 28-28 on whether or not to certify the questionable results. John Connolly persuaded Frank Mayborn, publisher of the Temple Daily Telegraph, to cut short a business trip to Nashville and return to cast the deciding committee vote to certify the election results. Well, it was challenged, and it goes to the Supreme Court, and LBJ turned for help to Washington attorney and former FDR appointee Abe Fortas. Abe Fortas persuaded Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, who was also appointed by FDR, to intervene. On September 28, 1948, Justice Black overturned the lower court ruling, letting the decision in the Johnson-Stevenson race rest with the Texas Democrat Central Committee. Well, in return for his favor, Abe Fortas was nominated in 1965 by President Johnson to be a justice on the Supreme Court. But in 1966, Abe Fortas accepted money from a Wall Street financier investigated for securities violations, and Abe Fortas was forced to resign. Well, Washington Post runs another article on it, how Landslide Lyndon earned his name. And the slimy creature who stole the 1948 Texas Senate election, Lyndon Johnson, driven by a boundless ambition. His career had been a story of manipulation, deceit, ruthlessness, the morality of the ballot box, in which nothing matters but victory, and any maneuver that leads to victory is justified. Johnson stole the victory in the 1948 Senate race. That campaign was an American classic, and so forth. 87-vote margin earned him the derisive nickname Landslide Lyndon. And in March of 2006, Texas Attorney General Greg Abbott posted a column on the Texas State Attorney General's website stating, voter fraud is no newcomer to the Lone Star State. 6 decades ago, the votes found in Jim Wells County's infamous ballot box 13 helped Lyndon Johnson squeak into the U.S. Senate in that 1948 primary. Now, you can have a choice to think that that was the only instance, and after that, they've never had any more, or they've been perfecting their maneuvers. Well, the book on socialism. By the way, I have a website, AmericanMinute.com, and I send out a free daily history email called American Minute. So if you do studies on socialism, it all goes back to Plato. He lived 380 BC in Athens, and he writes in passing of the island of Atlantis, this highly civilized island, very advanced, very structured, and it sinks in the ocean. Now, whether it was real or not, nobody knows for sure, but there is an island in the Mediterranean called Santorini. It was a volcano, and all that's left is the rim of it. And you may have seen it in tourist pictures because it's all painted white with blue, and it's just charming. I went there in college, and we took a cruise in the Mediterranean, and sounds fancier than it was, but for some reason. So anyway, there was an island, and it did blow up, and it was so massive it would have sent a tsunami wave all across the Mediterranean. So whether it was that island or some other, there could have been one that was there and it sunk. Nevertheless, Plato thought it existed, and Plato considered Atlantis the ideal structured society. And Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. He lived in Athens, where they had a democracy. Demos means people, krasi means rule. And the chief characteristic of a democracy is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's great. And then he says, the state is like a bazaar in which you can buy anything, a piece of embroidery in which the colors and figures are the manners of men. There will be the greatest variety of human natures. Such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government full of variety and disorder. And he says the manner of life is that of Democrats. Every man does what is right in his own eyes. I just think that's sort of funny that here he's describing a democracy, right? But the description sort of stays the same. He says the father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son and fear them, and the son, having no shame or fear of his parents. The teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise their masters and tutors. And then the citizens vote to take the money out of the treasury and spread it around. Now the treasury's empty. Then they vote to take the money from the rich people. The leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people, at the same time taking care to reserve for the larger part for themselves. Democracy's insatiable desire brings her to disillusion. He says that this tolerance now creeps into their morality, and he says the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. Yes, that's what he's talking about. He has parted company with all shame. And lo and behold, that theme repeats itself. And so in 1934, an Oxford anthropologist, J.D. Unwin, wrote a book called Sex and Culture. And he studied 80 civilizations over 5,000 years, including Athens. And he found out that loosening of sexual restraints always leads to civilizational decline. He says that first, a civilization goes through a period of pain and poverty. Maybe they go through a war or a famine. And then they work hard, and they become productive. And then they get protective. And then they become patriotic, and they're growing, and they're innovative, and they're expanding. And then they get prosperous. And then they begin to want to enjoy their prosperity. And they become pleasure-focused. And then they get promiscuous and indulgent, undisciplined, lawless, weakened, and they get conquered by the next rising civilization. Sort of like an athlete. When he's young, he's disciplined and focused and watches his diet and exercises every day, and then he finally wins the championship, and he rules for a couple seasons. And then he doesn't exercise quite as much, and maybe he's eating some fatty stuff that he shouldn't, but he still thinks he's the tough guy. And he gets in the ring of competition, and he gets the tar knocked out of him because in reality, he's a couch potato. And so J.D. Unwin says that this cycle is observable in all these civilizations. He's not a Christian, but he calls it a sexual marketplace. He says when the women say there has to be a commitment before anything happens, the guy says, well, whatever it takes. And then children appear. And then the guy wants to be productive and protective to provide and protect his family. And when all the men of the country do this, the whole country becomes productive and protective, and they begin to be strong and, expand and so forth. But when the women say there doesn't need to be a commitment, water seeks its own level. And you'll have a bunch of guys saying, hey, I'm going to get pleasure focused. And when enough of the guys do this, then they're selfish attention, and they're not as disciplined, and they're not as organized, and there's not as many children born to fill the ranks of the military. And when all the men do this, then the country ends up getting weakened, and they're conquered by the next civilization. John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty. Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy, intoxication, extravagance, vice, and folly? No effort in favor of virtue is lost. Harry S. Truman writes, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So what happened in the ancient Athens? So they tolerate each other, it's great. Then they tolerate people that are off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating crooks and crime and fraud and immorality and all kinds of looting. And it turns into this lawlessness and chaos. And then the people begin to say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And that's when some governor or mayor comes along and says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. And Plato says that last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's a protector. I want to protect you. We're gonna take some powers because I want to protect you. And then he's all full of smiles. But as he consolidates power, Plato says if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he will have a good pretext for destroying them. The protector finally standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand is revealed as a tyrant absolute. And what happens next? Well, he has a mob entirely at his disposal, and he is not restrained from shedding of blood. Oh, go ahead and exercise your First Amendment rights and destroy all those businesses that. And so this is Plato's model. Democracy without morals and virtue ends in chaos, out of which some tyrant governor or mayor usurps power. Plato says that democracy is doomed to fail because it's based on people having virtue, and people really don't have virtue. He says if you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. People say, oh, I can be a good person. I don't need God or anything. It's like, okay, will you hold to your being a good person even if it costs you your life? Most people say, well, I'll fudge if it's going to save my life, right? And so Plato said, now ancient Israel, their experiment of ruling themselves without a king, right, the first 400 years out of Egypt, their experiment worked a little longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God, that you were virtuous because you were accountable in the next life to God. Athens didn't have that. By Plato's time, Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. So, Plato writes this: if a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. He says, well, people really aren't virtuous. If a virtuous man was ever born, the world would crucify him. He wrote this 380 years before Christ. So Plato concluded that since democracy is eventually going to crash, the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant. He called him a philosopher king. And this philosopher king is the head of gold. And his administrators and military, his deep state political cronies, they are the arms and chest of silver. Together they make up the ruling class. And everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze, and they are the ruled class. So socialism is a socially structured society of a ruling class and a ruled class. Right? So here's Plato. Atlantis was structured. Democracy is unstructured. It's going to crash. And so let's get back to structured. And so the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by the commoners. They can do things like getting their hair styled when nobody else can. Okay. The ruled class, they own no property. They have no families. The government decides who gets to have children, and then the government takes the children away from the parents, and the children are brought into public schools where they're socialized, which is a process of getting them to give up the values of their parents and learn how to obey and serve the ruling class. Plato explained that this structured society, when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And these children will be taught lies, noble lies. He says, we want one single grand lie, which will be believed by everybody. Could you imagine the government taking the kids and teaching them lies? So, Plato's structured society on the island of Atlantis later inspired Sir Thomas More's island of Utopia in 1516. So this is 20 years after Columbus discovers America. And there's new lands, and gee, we could have new societies and make it perfect this time. And so Utopia means nowhere. It's a fictitious island off the coast of South America, supposedly discovered by Amerigo Vespucci. And it's written as a dialogue, a conversation with a traveler, and the traveler's name is Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. And so in Utopia, it's a perfectly structured society. It's got a ruling class and the upper class, lower commoners. There's free health care, free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There's common free meals in monastic communal dining halls. Everyone lives in identical 3-story public housing with no locks on doors. There is no private property. All goods and property are stored in a communal warehouse. There are no taverns, no alehouses, no coffee houses, no places for private meetings, gatherings. There's no privacy. Everyone is tracked everywhere they go with internal passports, and if you're caught without one, it is a lifetime of slavery. The government decides everyone's careers, that you got to work for the rest of your life, and there's no families. Again, the government decides who gets to have kids. Childbearing is regulated. This is like China's one-child policy or Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood, where she said, no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. So, Plato's perfect island of Atlantis. By the way, Sir Thomas More wrote this as a veiled jab against Henry VIII, who was wanting to control everybody's lives. Right? Henry VIII is the one who was Catholic, switches, becomes Anglican, and says everybody has to follow me on a dime if they don't. And so that's when Sir Thomas More got killed. And you read the condemnation. He was to be drawn and quartered and hanged till he was almost dead, and then taken out and then whipped and beaten. I mean, and then his insides cut out, and then he was finally, and then the executioner, we'll be nice to you. We'll just kill you. It's like, oh, thanks a lot. So Plato, Sir Thomas More, inspired Sir Francis Bacon. He lived at the time of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth and the scientific revolution. That's when they're discovering laws of gravity, laws of planetary motion, laws of optics, and the Pilgrims. Now, this book by Sir Francis Bacon is titled The New Atlantis. So he's directly referring to Plato's Atlantis. Now, this is a fictitious island in the South Pacific off the coast of Peru. And it's highly structured. It's got a ruling class. It's got the ruled class. And it's a little more scientific careers because of the scientific revolution. But the government dictates everything. Someone wrote a satire on this, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Right? Gulliver's washed up on an island. And Lilliput, and he finds it's highly structured with this ruling class that's ridiculous and wanting to control everybody. And the ruled class that just simply has to obey, and the government dictates all their lives. Why is this important? The Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims were originally a company colony with bylaws written by the investors in the company. And these investors looked back to Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon, and the common bylaws, company bylaws said everything was owned in common. The Pilgrims tried it and almost starved to death. And so the bylaws say all profits and benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or any other means shall remain in ye common stock. All are to have their meat, drink, apparel, and all provision out of ye common stock. William Bradford says the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. The Pilgrims knew they were trying to live out Plato and Sir Thomas More's utopia where everything's owned in common. They knew what they were doing. That the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent, retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter what the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc., with the humbler and younger ones, thought it some indignity and disrespect to them. As for men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Let none argue that this is due to human failing rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn, obtain a better crop than they had done, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want, like starving in winter. At length, after much debate, the governor with the chief among them allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. Hey, I got an idea. Why doesn't each man plant corn for his own household? And so every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and gave far better satisfaction.
the women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So we got this theoretical Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon. We got the Pilgrims trying to actually live out this thing, and it fails, and they scrap it, and they give everybody their own plot of land. And so we see that socialism always has two sides to it. One is the promise, the other is the reality. Sounds really good on a chalkboard, but when you try to live it out, it crashes. So it promises a dream, it delivers a nightmare. It's a cultural bait and switch. And when people don't know the history, when the bait comes along, it's like, oh, this looks really good. I mean, imagine if fish could compile a little history and they could pass it on to the young fish. When you see something sparkling in the water, stay away from it, right? But the fish can't pass that along, so the next fish comes along, something sparkly, I think I'm going to eat it, right? Every time that, and so now didn't the early church have socialism? I mean, they owned everything in common. Well, two very important differences: voluntary versus involuntary, and church versus government. So the early believers voluntarily sold their property, and they brought the money to the feet of the apostles to distribute. They were not forced to involuntarily sell their land and lay the money at the feet of Pilate. Right? Here, Pilate, here's a little more money for you to spread the Roman government around. Okay, they'll kill more people. Now, why is this important? Voluntary is a big thing with God. And so you think of it, I sort of get a little imaginative. So there's my latest fascination is the Hubble telescope, and it circles the Earth. There's no atmosphere to block it. And so in 2003, they focused it on a spot in the sky where there was nothing for 2 weeks. And the spot was so small, if you were to hold a grain of sand up against the night sky between your fingers, that is the size of the spot that they focused this Hubble telescope on. After 2 weeks, they got the images back, and they found in that little spot was 10,000 galaxies. And then they said, whoa, and then they start looking at other little spots, and they found it's everywhere. They said, and all of a sudden, the whole, and so they call it the Hubble Deep Space Field. You can look it up. It's really fascinating. And so when you look at it, there's so many trillions and trillions and trillions of stars, and it goes up, they estimate 40 billion light years across, and it's expanding at the speed of light. So there's no way that, so you just have to face it. God is all-powerful. He is awesome. He is all-powerful. He is all-knowing. It's not that he knows everything. It's impossible for him not to know everything. He's eternal. He's existed for eternity. And if you think it, what are galaxies? They're just a bunch of rocks. Big rocks, enormous rocks, hot rocks, cold rocks. A rock cannot love you. And so sometime in eternity past, God said, been there, done that. I can make galaxies. I really want someone in my image that could love me. Now it gets interesting, because love, by definition, must be voluntary. The moment it's forced, it evaporates. And so God sets up this thing we call reality, and you really can't control anything but your will. And you're given a choice throughout your life to choose God or not. And I was explaining to somebody, imagine if there's a billionaire and he has a son that's going to college, and he drives up on campus with a Lamborghini and Porsche, and he's got gold rings and fancy clothes. He's going to have every girl wanting to meet him, right? But if he drives up in an old clunker, and he's got holes in his jeans, the uppity girls are going to ignore him. But then he meets some girl, and they like to study together in the library. And then they go out for an ice cream cone, and then they end up getting to know each other. They fall in love and get engaged. And then he says, I want to take you back to meet my dad. Right? And you're driving up this mansion and this, castle, and she's like, whoa, you didn't tell me about this. Right? So if Jesus would have come to earth as the Son of God, every political ladder climber would want to be, I'm your friend, but he wouldn't know who loves him for him and who loves him just because he's all-powerful Son of God. And so he lays that aside and comes to earth, humbled as a man. Anyway, why is that? To give you the voluntary choice to choose him. Got a little preachy there, but so voluntary, so that Moses in the wilderness says, anybody that wants to bring stuff to build the tabernacle in the wilderness, bring it. And so they were moved upon to bring cloth and jewels and gold, and they built it. And he didn't send out the soldiers to go to everybody's tent and take it away involuntarily. God's really into this voluntary thing. So when people say, oh, early church, they were socialists, they had everything in common. No, they weren't. Because socialism, by definition, Lenin said, I think I got a slide here. Maybe not. Maybe somewhere in there. Anyway, it'll come up sooner or later. Lenin said, socialism is a transition phase to communism. And Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. Yet the Bible gives private property to each family when they went into the promised land. If you own private property, you can be moved upon in your heart to voluntarily give away some of it. That is called charity. The Bible's filled full of all kinds of encouragements for you to be charitable. If the government takes away all your property, you can't be charitable. What are you going to steal something from somebody else and now you're a thief and you're going to give it away to somebody? And they gave it to the church. So again, they lay it at the feet of the apostles. Whenever the church helps people, it wants the church to it wants the person to get up out of their situation and become successful. Why? So then they can help the next person that comes along. Whenever the government helps anybody, it's in exchange for something. So in Egypt, the people needed food, and the government says, we'll give you a bag of grain, but it's in exchange for your land, your cattle, your life, and so forth. And anyway, confusion as to the role of government. God gives commands to 5 groups in the Bible: individuals, families, business, church, and government. There are commands for individuals to take care of the poor, visit the sick. There's really no commands for the families to take care of the poor. Those commands are husbands, love your wives, and children, submit to your parents. The business, those commands are do an honest day's work and don't hold back wages. There are commands for the church to take care of the poor, and historically the church has started orphanages, medical clinics, and hospitals. There's no command for the government to take care of the poor. The command to the government is the shortest: protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in health care or welfare or education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. People say, well, we need to take care of the poor. Yes, we do, but it's not the government's job to do it. It's the individuals and it's the church. Here's a quote from Calvin Coolidge. It does not follow that because something ought to be done, the national government ought to do it. And here's a great quote from Gerald Ford. He says, people say, why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money? I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? So the Pilgrims, they got rid of their company and they came up with a covenant. What's the difference? Company is involuntary. Covenant is voluntary. What's a covenant? It's people committed to caring for each other because you're accountable to God. Jesus says, whatever you do to the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me. And you get individual rights from God. And the, New England, they got this idea from Israel. The first 400 years when Israel came out of Egypt, it was called the Hebrew Republic. And they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And so if you think of government as a spectrum, one side's total government, the other side's no government. Total government, you get a king, he rules through fear. You do what the government tells you to do, or you're going to get punished. The no government side, that would be anarchy. No government? Unless each person is taught the law, right? So for the people to rule themselves without a king, they need to have virtue. Remember Plato talked about that? So what's the virtue? It's the law. And every individual is taught the law. Now I was thinking of a way of explaining this, and I thought of a GPS on your phone. Right? So everyone has a phone with a GPS on it that tells you to turn left 50 yards ahead. Imagine if there was a behavioral app that you could download and it would tell you how to act in real time. Don't steal that off that table. Don't lose your temper at that person, right? And the Levites were the computer geeks that helped you to download the app. Now, how do I download? Go to Apple Play, Google Store, and line upon line, precept upon precept. So everybody downloads their own copy of the law, and they have it memorized. But the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel introduced the key ingredient. There is a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something. Nobody's around, no police. You know you can get away with it, and then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable in the future. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. And it creates something in your head called the conscience. If everybody in the country really believes this, you can maintain complete order, safety, security. Women can go anywhere without fear with no police. Maximum liberty. Now, the children of Israel, God knew that they would break the law, and rather than them walking around for the rest of their life with a guilty conscience, once a year they had the Day of Atonement, where they would have the sacrifice that everybody in the country would be forgiven for the year. All right, so they'd all start off the next year with a clean conscience. Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. If there's no God, laws are just something made up by a bunch of old men. Why follow them? And so what happens is if you get rid of God, all you got is a bunch of these laws somebody made up. Why follow them? Some will, some won't. Some will as long as it's socially acceptable to be virtuous, like Plato talked about. But those that won't are going to yield to their selfish side, and they're going to turn into an unstructured mess. They're going to rob, steal, kill, smash windows, set buildings on fire, turn into chaos. And what happened in ancient Israel? Well, their chaos got so bad, they wanted a king, right? The rubber band snapped back, and they got a tyrant governor. So, priests stopped teaching the law. Eli, the main priest that's supposed to be teaching it, his own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then another Levite with a silver graven image in the house of a guy named Micah. The tribe of Dan comes along and takes the graven image and tells the Levite, come along with us and be a priest to our whole tribe. And you're reading the story, scratching your head, saying, what's this Levite doing with a graven image? Isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have them? Levites weren't following the law. And then a story of a Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite is to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. And they're in a house surrounded by sodomites. Something about that behavior that appears at the last stages of a people ruling themselves, this casting off of restraint. And sort of like Plato, right? The young man gives into libertinism and useless and unnecessary pleasures. And lo and behold, the Bible says every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Why? Because the priests had stopped teaching what was right in the Lord's eyes. And it turned into an unstructured chaos mess. And they began to say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And that's when they all go to Samuel the prophet and they said, we want a king. And Samuel cries and the Lord tells him, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. So they get a king, his name's Saul, and he turns into a tyrant. And he's pouting that his son, Jonathan, had made friends with David. And he tells his soldiers, none of you guys care about me. And one soldier, Doeg the Edomite, says, King, I care. I saw David go to this town. The priest gave him some bread and the sword of Goliath that was stored there. Saul says, bring those priests to me. When they come, he turns to his soldiers and says, kill them. The soldiers hesitate. Doeg the Edomite goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been following the old system where every person is accountable to God to follow the law. The law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn someone to death. There's only one witness, Doeg. So the soldiers are hesitating. They were like, okay, you're telling me to kill, and there's only one witness, and the Bible says there's 2, and needs to be 2. I'm accountable to God. They still have a conscience. They're hesitating. They have a conscience. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. You tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. You tell me there's no more male and female, it's fluid sex, you can go to any bathroom you want. Well, fine, government, whatever you tell me. When you blow your trumpets, I'll bow to your statue, right? If you tell me that the color yellow is now verboten, okay, I'll get rid of the color yellow. I mean, it's like, whatever you tell me, I'm just going to surrender all my views and values to the state, and you just dictate to me what I'm supposed to believe. Now, any book on socialism goes back to the French Revolution. And every socialist and communist revolution goes back to the French Revolution. Now, let's look at this. We had France help us during our revolution. You know what they got in return? Nothing but debt. Lots of it. And then they had a couple years where the crops failed. And the people said, you know what, if we can just chop off King Louis XVI and his wife Queen Marie Antoinette's heads, all of our problems will be solved. Well, they chop them off. It doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of all the royalty. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of all the wealthy. You have money and I don't. You're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You got food and supplies. We don't. You're selfish. And then they chop off the heads of the hoarders. They got extra food stored up. You got extra. I don't have enough. You're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy because they were speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. Then they chopped off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it. Somehow they're to blame. 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. And the motto of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity was the French word for socialism. It's the group, the collective, right? And equality can be understood two ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law, equal opportunity. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternity, the group, the collective, the state thinks you have too much stuff, it can use the power of the state to take away your stuff and even kill you. During this time in America, Timothy Dwight, Yale president, writes about the year 1728, Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism, which the being of God was denied and ridiculed. Possession of property was pronounced robbery. You got property, right? You must have taken it, you know. Chastity, natural affection were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices, right? You know, when you want to get, you know, married or not, you want to be a boy or a girl, I mean, whatever, it's just your own prejudice. And adultery, assassination, poisonings, and other crimes of like infernal nature were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. So as long as you think your end is good, it's okay for you to smash all the windows and set on fire. The education of youth, books replete with infidelity, irreligion, immorality, and obscenity. Sort of like Common Core. To destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God. Or maybe limit the number of people that can go to church and so forth. And notice the education of the youth. Remember, Plato says you got to take the youth away from the parents and indoctrinate them. So this reign of terror in France, they wanted to tear down statues. Tearing down statues sounds familiar. So the statue of good King Henry IV, he lived in the 1500s trying to patch up Protestants and Catholics. Well, they tear his statue down. And then St. Genevieve, she was a young woman in 450 A.D. when Attila the Hun was scourging Europe. And she got all of Paris to fast and pray. And for some reason, Attila skipped sacking Paris. So she's considered the patron saint of Paris. Well, during the French Revolution, they dig up her bones and trash them. They're just wanting to tear down all the history that there was there. And this is actually a process called deconstruction. And it's where you tear down the past, portray the past as all negative, and then you get the people into an open-minded and they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into a future you have planned for them. It's a sales technique. So if I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is I tell you negative things about the toothpaste you are currently using. You're still brushing with that old stuff? Haven't you read it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? You're like, ooh, really? You're repulsed by it. Now I got you in a neutral. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpastes out there? Then I give you my pitch for this brand new tartar control breath freshener toothpaste. So that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from Indians. They sold people into slavery. They were chauvinists. And ooh, the students are repulsed by them. Now you got the kids into a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them your pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islam. So it's a drive neutral reverse. It's like a gene replacement therapy for a culture. You take out the old DNA, you put in the new. And Europe went through this. It went from a Judeo-Christian Europe with Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods to a secular Europe with the French Revolution, free sex, anything goes. And now it's turning into a Sharia socialist Europe, with Muhammad being the #1 name for newborns and the government deciding everyone's careers. So the government pays for everybody's education, And if you score bad on a couple tests, the government channels you into career paths. And later you decide to take your studies serious and you want to switch and be a doctor. Sorry, you can't. I actually knew a guy, and he wanted to be a doctor, and he didn't pass a couple tests right, and they would not let him switch. And he had to just, do the career they picked out for him. Carl Sandburg says, when a nation goes down, one condition may always be found: they forgot where they came from. So you have to tear down the history. Now, it's not just tearing down Judeo-Christian history, it's any history. So China, 300 BC, 3rd century BC, this is the Warring States period, where they have a half a dozen Chinese kingdoms fighting. And one wins. The leader, Qin Shi Huangdi, considered the founder of the Han Dynasty. And Qin Shi Huangdi was being criticized for doing things differently than they had been done before. And he did not like being criticized, so he decided to destroy all records of how things were done before. And his chancellor, Li Si, wrote in 213 BC, I, your servant, propose that all historians' records, other than those of the house of Qin, be burned. If anyone under heaven has copies of the classics of history, they shall deliver them to the governor for burning. Anyone who dares discuss the classics of history shall be publicly executed. Anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have his family executed. Anyone who has failed to burn the books after 30 days of this announcement shall be sent to build the Great Wall. Well, that is what Mao Zedong did in the 1960s. It's called the Cultural Revolution. He destroyed the oldest Buddhist temple in China. He destroyed the Great Gates of Beijing. He destroyed thousands of years of Chinese history. Why? Because he wanted to erase the history so that there's millions of these uneducated young people could be brainwashed into the People's Republic of China. And this is just a current article. It says Xi Jinping in China ordering erasure of Genghis Khan from Chinese history. So Genghis Khan was the Mongolian, and he came down and conquered China, and for 100 years, the Mongolians ruled over China, and they considered it an embarrassment. And so he decides to erase it. So they were having a big Genghis Khan historical thing in Paris where they bring artifacts, and China put pressure on Paris to cancel it. And Pol Pot did the same thing in Cambodia. He made 1975 the new year zero. And he said anything prior to that was irrelevant. And then he killed anybody that wore glasses. He said if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history. And so he kills a third of his country, millions of people. And actually gave this address at an event in Des Moines, Iowa. And there was a lady there that had grown up under Pol Pot's regime. And it was Concerned Women for America organized it. And she talked about how they came and they got all these young people that were in the Cambodian Khmer Rouge, red Chinese, red communist, and they would come into a village and they would just kill off all the people that wouldn't agree. And then she said that they were all kids and they were re-indoctrinating them. And they asked the kids, who's not loyal to the Communist Party? And if you didn't tell, they would beat you. And so she said that we would just pick out the name of some person, even if they weren't guilty, and they would, in front of everybody, drag that person away and kill them. And she said they all felt so bad because they knew that person wasn't guilty, but they just felt. And she says this is what happened in Cambodia. So the Muslims do this. They destroy history. Whenever they come into a country, they destroy. When they went into Alexandria, Egypt, in the 600s, around 638 AD. There was the oldest library in the world. Had stuff went back to Abraham's day. They asked Caliph Umar what to do with it. And he said, every book that does not agree with the Quran, destroy. And every book that does agree with the Quran is redundant because we have the Quran, so destroy them all. It took 6 months to burn them all. But this is the idea, and they still do it today, smashing the history. Why? Because you want to erase the memory of the past so the people have no clue where they came from, so that you can brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. And so we're doing this today in America with the 619 Project and the socialist Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. So anybody that had anything to do with this great country was bad, bad, bad. Kids get emotionally detached from them, and then you can give your pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islam. So French Revolution. they do that, and they want to erase Christian influence. Why is that important? If so long as there's a God, you have this nagging teaching that you have rights from this God, and that everybody's equal. And they want to get rid of that. They want to say you got rights from the government. And so they do all this persecution there in Paris. And they even killed entire orders of nuns. And there's these nuns, they're singing their church song as they're being marched up this scaffold. And one by one, they have heads chopped off. So there'd be, till finally only one person was singing, and then she got her head chopped off. And anyway, they did the similar thing in Mexico in 1917. But and then there's a rural area, hundreds of miles away from Paris. It's called the Vendée. They think they're safe. Well, guess what? They send their federal army out to that rural area, and they kill 300,000 men, women, and children that wouldn't want to go along with this new secular government. It's considered the first modern genocide. And this became a model for every socialist revolution afterwards, that it's okay to kill off lots and lots of people, to tear down the old order so that you can have something new happen that ends up getting run by a dictator. That's the problem. And so what happened in Paris, let's a couple more things. Robespierre puts a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covers her with a sheet, said this is the goddess of reason, let's worship her. They didn't want done in the year of the Lord because it went back to the Bible. And so they made 1792 the new year one. They didn't want a 7-day week because it went back to the Bible. So they came up with a 10-day week, a decade week. Each day had 10 decimal hours. Each hour had 100 decimal minutes. Each minute had 100 decimal seconds. They used this for over a dozen years in France. They said 10 was the number of man because you count with 10 fingers. And so they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. Anyway, so in France, since there's no God, there's no right, there's no wrong, who decides what's right and wrong? The state, the mob, the group, the collective, the fraternity, the state. Well, democracy without morals and virtue ends in chaos, out of which a tyrant arises. Well, they got their tyrant, Napoleon. And he crowns himself emperor and has Napoleonic wars that kill 6 million across Europe. Well, after Napoleon's banished to the island of St. Helena, Europe is gathering together again. And the king of Prussia said, we can't get conquered that easy again. We need to strengthen the state. And so he gets a philosopher named Hegel. And I'll tell you about him in a second. But there's 4 slides that we want to see the progression of what happened. We go from a pilgrim covenant, where it's agreement, and not just an agreement, but you're wanting to care for each other because you're accountable to God. It's a voluntary caring, and you get rights from God. In the next century, covenant turned into social contract with the Age of Enlightenment. This is just an agreement with each other. You're not committed to caring for, you're just an agreement. And if God is there, he is distant. He's impersonal. This comes again out of the scientific revolution, where Copernicus and Kepler discovered laws of planetary motion, and Newton discovers laws of gravity and laws of optics, and Robert Boyle discovers laws of pressure. And so some theologian says, well, maybe God made everything with laws, and like a guy winds up a clock and sets it on his shelf, maybe everything's just following these gears and rules. And if God is there, he's distant, he's uninvolved. Don't even bother praying because he's not going to intervene. And so we go from covenant with a personal God, and to social contract with a distant God, to the French Revolution, which is a social contract with no God. And the next century turned into Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. And you get your rights from the state, you're accountable to the state. And if the state does not think that you're worth anything, the state can kill you. Hegel, the German philosopher in Berlin, said, the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state. Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract, says, when the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. So 100 years later in Germany, you got the Nazi Party in 1933. It says the Nazi Ministry of Justice. Nazi stands for National Socialist Workers' Party. National Arbeiter, which means worker, Socialistisches Party. And so Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. And that influenced Pol Pot in Cambodia. He says, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. And so we got this transition, the covenant to social contract, distant God, social contract with no God, to the state is God. Hegel says the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract rule of good and bad? Like the Ten Commandments? In other words, there's no limits on the state. It is just a power grab by the state. And if the state thinks that you're helping it grab more power, the state thinks your life is valuable and you get to live. If you're challenging the state's power grab, the state will use its power to kill you. That's all it is. There's no God. There's no rights from a God. It's just a power grab by the state. And so Eisenhower said, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The Founding Fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make their revolutionary experiment make sense. It was because all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. In other words, do your rights come from the government or do they come from a source higher than the government? Right. And the government's job is to protect our God-given rights. Now, we talked about the natural flow that democracy and republics without morals and virtue ends in chaos, out of which some tyrant usurps power. Some ambitious politicians want to speed this along by intentionally creating crises. And so we have a Bible example. Here's how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. But it says, Proverbs 6 things the Lord hates: proud look, lying tongue, hand swift to shedding innocent blood, but he that soweth discord. So we got unity, we got discord. And what was a Bible example? Gideon had an illegitimate son named Abimelech. And he decides to sow discord. There's peace in Israel. They just defeated 100,000 Midianites. There's peace. And so Abimelech goes to the town of Shechem, and he engages in race politics, identity politics. He says, is it better for you that all the sons of Gideon reign over you? Remember also that I am your bone and your flesh. And his brethren spake unto him in the ears of the men of Shechem with all these words, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is our brother. So forget whether he is a better ruler or not than the other Gideon sons. It's just identity. So Abimelech took money from the treasury to hire protesters and rioters to commit violence and kill all his half-brothers. And they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Balberith, wherewith Abimelech hired vain and worthless persons, like Antifa type, to follow him. And they went into his father's house at Ophrah and slew his brethren. And the men of Shechem made Abimelech king. So they got rid of their republic, and now they've got a king. And it would have continued had not somebody thrown a millstone off the wall and killed him. Now let's look at another example. Italy, 500 years ago, was not Italy. It was a bunch of city-states. Venice, Genoa, Naples, Florence, Siena. They all had armies and navies and fought. And Machiavelli thought, if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling all of Italy is such a good end, because it'll stop the infighting, that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So if a prince conquers a city, the people would hate him. But if the prince pays criminals to kill cows, burn barns, create crisis, the people will cry out for help. The prince will come in and get rid of the very people he bribed to create the crises. Nobody will know the better for it, and everyone will praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, and then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. You know that better as this line. You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. It is an opportunity to do those things that you thought you could not do before. Rahm Emanuel. Hillary Clinton says, the chief of staff for President Obama is an old friend of mine, my husband's. He said, never waste a good crisis. So you and I go through a crisis. Our response is, how do we help people through it? They see a crisis. Their response is, how can we use this crisis to usurp power? So Hegel, he makes it into a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite corner is an antithesis, the top corner is a synthesis. Sounds complicated, but it's not. You start off with the status quo, you create a problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to sell for your answer that's half as bad. And then that becomes the new starting point, and you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Then you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And after each crisis, people surrender a little bit more of their freedom, their rights, and so forth. And so who was a student at the University of Berlin under Hegel? But Karl Marx. He was a member of the Young Hegelians, a radical student group. And he says, well, how do you create the antithesis, the crisis? You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to create crises, and then people will give up their freedoms to have order restored. So he would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners. Organize the poor against the rich, blacks against the whites, Catholics against the Protestants, Muslims against the Christians, Hutus against the Tutsis. Didn't matter. His job was to have a destabilizing crisis. He that soweth discord. So how did socialism come to America? Well, in 1894, Eugene Debs. There's the Pullman Railroad Car Company in Chicago. They have little villages, little shops, and then the factory, and all their work in there. It's great until orders for railroad cars drop. And the people are now struggling. And Eugene Debs goes over and says, hey, there's an opportunity to sow discord. And he organizes riots that destroy $80 million worth of railroad cars in 27 states in 1894. Grover Cleveland had to send in the U.S. Army to stop it. And then Eugene Debs starts the Socialist Party of America. And he runs for president 5 times between 1900 and 1920. One time he ran from prison. And then in 1920, off splits the Communist Party USA, and they run candidates for president every year from 1920 to 1940. But then in 1940 here's that quote I was looking for. Socialism is a transition phase to communism. But in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt made a treaty with Stalin during World War II. And so the Communist Party USA said, why should we run our own candidate? Let's just support the Democrats. And so from 1940 on, the Communist Party USA has supported Democrats. And I've even talked to Democrats. I knew Zell Miller, who was a Democrat senator years ago. He was pro-life. And he says, they stole our party. And so let's look at Germany, 1920s and 30s. It was a republic, the Weimar Republic. The people would vote for their leaders. And then somebody started a political party. It was Hitler. Started the National Socialist Workers' Party, Nazi. And it had a violent arm to it. Sort of like a Antifa, BLM, or a KKK type arm. And these were called brown shirts. They were nicknamed Sturmabteilung, which means stormtroopers, because they would storm into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and disrupt the meetings and shout down the speakers. And then they would lock arms and block access to buildings and block streets. Could you imagine people locking arms and blocking streets? And then they went into the cities and smashed windows and looted and set on fire over 7,000 Jewish stores in the night of broken glass. And then their capital got set on fire. And in this confusion, started by these brown shirts, Hitler seizes power and kills all his enemies, and he is now a dictator. So Germany transitions from a republic, bottom up, to a dictatorship, top down, because the creation of these riots by the brown shirts. Well, after World War II, Germany, France, and England give independence to their former colonies. And it's a nice world where they start brand new countries with brand new leaders, and they're climbing out of the post-war problems. And it's promising, except the Soviet Union decides it doesn't want communism just running the Soviet Union. It wants it to run the world. So they send KGB agents into Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and all these countries, and they find groups with grievances. Ethnic, Bosnian Serbs, Croats, religious, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, racial, religious. I mean, all that they don't care. Their goal is to identify people as victims and oppressors. haves and have-nots. And then they would organize protests that would always escalate into riots, that would escalate into violence, and then they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the leader of the country for all the problems. And then they would nurture weak links in the military, and when the country got panicky and confused enough, they would do a coup or a rigged election and replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And you look at their tactics, so all these countries fell, and their tactics included having the media releasing false polling data prior to an election to show the popular leader as unpopular, so when they did the coup or the rigged election, people wouldn't fight it. It's called the psychological operation. And so this got the Iron Curtain now with all these countries. Truman does nothing. He thinks the United Nations he helped form will bring world peace, but the next president's Eisenhower. He says the United Nations seems to be two distinct things to the two worlds divided by the Iron Curtain. To the free world, it seemed that it should be a constructive forum. To the communist world, it has been a sounding board for their propaganda and a weapon for it to be exploited for spreading disunity and confusion. So Truman can either do nothing and let these countries fall or fight fire with fire. And so Iran decides to side with the Soviet Union in 1953. And Iran nationalizes their oil industry. And you think, what's the big deal? Wait a second. Britain has no oil. And Winston Churchill changed the British Navy to oil in 1908. And so that's when they formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. BP is really the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Well, when Iran nationalizes their oil, Britain has no oil. They have an oil shortage. So they appeal to Eisenhower for help. And Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's Operation Ajax. And the CIA operative on the ground is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He's an expert in foreign languages. He goes to Tehran and he recruits gangsters and mobsters and radical imams, and he stages protests and riots that attack mosques and co-ops the media with bribes and threats to blame Mossadegh and nurture weak links in the military. And when the country gets panicky enough, they put Mossadegh under house arrest, lock him away for the rest of his life where he dies, and they install the Shah, who loved America because we put him in. And the CIA did the same thing in Guatemala and the Congo, Dominican Republic, Chile, and the KGB did the same thing with Brezhnev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO, and Brezhnev helping Castro to take over Cuba and taking over countries, Latin, South America, and hundreds of coups that took place in Africa. This is called the Cold War. Chris Matthews, in his last interview before he was fired, said this after a Democrat candidate debate: "I remember the Cold War. I've seen what socialism is like, and I don't like it, okay? It's not only not free, it doesn't work. I believe that if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park." And so Castro executions, well, here's Castro's executioners, Che Guevara. He said, "We executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess that I discovered I really like killing. Blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitations, transforming the soldier into an effective, selective, cold-killing machine people without triumph cannot hate." And then Karl Marx and Frederick Engels writes the Communist Manifesto, and then they write this, that they were alchemists of the revolution. Their business consisted in spurring it into artificial crises. Every new crisis must be more serious and more universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed. In the end, commercial crisis will lead to social revolution. So they want to get rid of the middle class. We scratch our heads, why are they doing these things? It's not helping business. They want to get rid of the business. So all you got is the ruling class and the ruled class. And anyway, let's skip stuff for the sake of time here. And they want to infiltrate the churches. And so in 1930s, a black man, Manning Johnson, became a communist. He actually ran for Congress in New York as a communist. And then after 10 years realized that they really didn't want to help his people. And so he left, and he actually gave testimony to the U.S. Congress, and he wrote a book. And Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt, wrote the foreword to it. And he talked about how the communists came in and wanted to do the same thing in Russia by getting rid of religion. make him spit on the Bible and kick the Bibles. And he says people in the minority communities were so attached to the Bible that they weren't getting anywhere. So he said they decided to change their tactics and change the gospel. He says the new line went like this: Jesus, the carpenter, was a worker like the communists. He was against money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of the day. That is why he drove them from the temple. Communists are the modern day fighters against the capitalists and money changers. If Jesus were living today, he would be persecuted like the communists. And so this message is the one they used, and it's called social justice. Alexander Solzhenitsyn says, I call upon America to be more careful with its trust, prevent those from falsely using the struggle for social justice to lead you down a false road. So we got Saul Alinsky, last couple of minutes. He is in Chicago. He rides around with Al Capone's hitman, Frank Nitti, and sees how all you got to do is kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would panic and agree to pay the mob protection money. So he applies it to politics. Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky says the first step in community organizing is community disorganizing. A disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. Organizer must stir up dissatisfaction, discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to point of overt expression. While the organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict, he must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. And he dedicates his book, has an acknowledgement in his book to Lucifer. Right? You can buy a copy. Ben Carson's a friend of mine, and he actually noted this in his speech at the Republican convention. And he says, first radical rebelled and so forth, and won his own kingdom, Lucifer. And what's he talking about? The line, he that soweth discord. That's the strategy. And then they do blame shifting, where they sow the discord, but they accuse you of doing it. Right? And they commit the crime, they accuse you of it, because then in the public's eye, your name is associated with it. And so we see these crises that have been passed in America, and then we see the current COVID response. What was it? Let criminals out of jail. Like, who does this? And then crime goes up. It's like, duh. And then some people feel unsafe and move out of the big cities. Well, who moves out? Well, maybe those with families. Okay, pro-family. They're usually belonging to one political party. Who's left in the city? More people that are dependent on government entitlements. They usually belong to a different political party. And then businesses are closed and vandalized, and so pro-business people move out of the city. Okay, they usually belong to that first political party. And then churches are shut down where social conservatives gather. Okay, they belong to that first party. And then schools are closed, letting these high school and college kids that have been indoctrinated with Hate America out to riot. The net COVID response was what? More people of one political party move out of the big cities, leaving the other party with monopoly control of city politics. If somebody wanted to do voter fraud, there would be fewer people of the other party to watch. And in presidential election years, whoever wins the big city, for some reason, wins the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president is elected by electoral votes. There's a clear advantage to one party of the COVID response. Have crime go up, you have one party leaves, the other one gets a monopoly, they win the big city, they win the state, they get all the electoral votes for the state, they can vote in the president. Anyway, I thought I'd just come give you a little encouragement tonight, and everything. And now, one big picture is that you go through world history, 6,000 years of it. It's all kings, pharaohs, Caesars, Kaisers, sultans, czars. And power wants to keep concentrating into the hands of one person over and over again. And what made America unique? We flipped it. Instead of top down, it's bottom up, rule by we. It's the difference between a dead pyramid and a living tree, where every root and every little capillary root sucks up nutrients. So who's the king in America? The signer of the Constitution, Gouverneur Morris. The magistrate is not the king. The people are the king. John Jay, the people are the sovereign of this country. James Wilson, sovereignty resides in the people. Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. Grover Cleveland, sovereignty of 60 millions of free people is the working out of the divine right of man to govern himself, a manifestation of God's plan concerning the human race. Anyway, so who's the king? We are. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-ruler or co-king. Right? You're a citizen, you're a co-king of America. And James Wilson, signer of the Declaration, every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote. Not to vote is to abdicate the throne. And anyway, Imagine visiting a king, going through the streets of a city in maybe the Old Testament, and you get into the king's chamber, and he's all worried. And he said, did you see all that crime coming in here, all the rape and murder and everything? I wish somebody would fix it. And you like reach over and tap him on the shoulder and say, you're the king. This is your kingdom. I think you're the one that's supposed to fix it. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix this. Hello, have a finger reach through the screen and tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. You're the one accountable to God to fix it. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, can somebody tell me what, hey, butler, come here, what am I supposed to do? No, it's your job to get educated on the issues, seek God's will, and you tell your representatives what needs to happen. You're the king, right? Anyway, last quote, Chief Justice John Jay, your lives, your liberty, your property will be at the disposal only of your Creator and yourselves. If I were to sum up what makes America great, it's this quote right here. Your lives, your liberty, and your property are at the disposal of you and God. You get to decide what career you want to pursue, where you want to live, who you want to marry, right? What food you want to eat. You can eat pork if you want to. You don't have to wear burqas. You decide what you want to do with your life. And then all of us together decide what's going to happen in the country. Anyway, I'll throw in one more and then I'll end. Reagan, in this country of ours, see, Charlie told you. Reagan said, in this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in the world's history. Every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another. Here, for the first time in all the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the founding fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves, the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Yes, for a live audience, we probably need to use this. Any questions? Thanks, Randy. One question I have is, what would you say to us locally here in the state of Oklahoma, Logan County GOP? What can we, or what do you see from a national perspective that we can do as people here in Oklahoma to help affect our nation, our state, for everything that you see in the radical move of socialism in our nation?
Great question. Make a lot of noise. The 1980, James Buchanan won the Nobel Prize in economics because he found out what motivates politicians. He's in economics. He says, okay, the biggest thing on the budget is debt. And why do these people up there keep voting for more debt, more debt, more debt? He found out that if they're up for re-election, they'll vote to spend more money in their district because it'll help their re-election. And they won't vote for any tax increase to pay for it because that'll hurt their re-election. He wins the Nobel Prize because he finds out that most politicians will do whatever it takes to get reelected. So why is that important? You make noise and say, if you don't do what we tell you to do, we're going to make all kinds of noise to get you out of office and ruin your re-election chances. And if you stand up for what we want, we'll get out there and we'll hit the pavement and we'll work to get you back in there. All right? And so I was Senator Dirksen of Illinois. There's a building in the Capitol named after him, the Dirksen building. But Senator Dirksen said, when I feel the heat, I see the light. And I was doing a Google search, right, to pull, well, where did he say this? You know, I like to always get the setting. First site that comes up is an Islamic site. And it says, in America, this is how the politics works. The politicians, when they feel the heat, they see the light. And so they said, let's just go and barrage these politicians to get them to cave to do what we want. They're here less than a generation, and they figured this out, and we're still scratching our heads thinking, oh, okay, how are you? So anyway. You number one, learn what they're doing. Jesus says, be wise as a serpent, but innocent as a dove. So we got to know all their tactics, but we don't yield and do unjust things like that. The second is we do all that we can up to the line before we violate morals, and then we say, God, I'm going to trust you for the rest, right? And so he's got to be a part of our equation. Yes? Yeah, so I'm still praying for a miracle, and because you're right, the spirit that's behind the other side would love to be like China going into Hong Kong and saying, okay, freedom is over and we're going to arrest everybody. And I could see it precipitously. Within 100 days, we wouldn't recognize them. I guarantee there'd be a million more crises that they would use as excuses to take away every one of our freedoms. I'm praying that we have a miracle, that doesn't happen. And I'm encouraged again through faith, and I end a lot of my talks sometimes by reminding people, someday you're going to be dead. Oh, Charlie, yes. Amen. Yeah. Yeah, the easiest time to stand up is now, and if we don't, it's going to be harder later, and then harder and harder and harder until it's at the point of a gun. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, there's two ways for a drug dealer to take over a neighborhood: come in with guns or give away free drugs and get everybody hooked. There's two ways to have countries turn socialist: roll in with tanks like into Czechoslovakia, or get everybody dependent on free stuff from the government, and once they do, you can yank their chain, say, I'm going to stop giving you free stuff unless you surrender all your values. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's a bait and switch. It's like a shyster salesman that promises a product will do something, and you get it home and it doesn't work, right? So they promise it, but the dilemma is that there are certain things that it's difficult, if not impossible, to undo. You can't unfall off a cliff. Yes. No,
I read a lot of the Italian history, like Roman history. I'm reading the Prince. I've read a lot. Rules for Radical. And took my mind was blown with all that happened under Orthodox Cultural Revolution, Roman Square, all of it. It's like it's in history. And what I'm starting to realize, something I undertook a few months ago, is like you can think that somebody has the same values as you because they're Christian too, maybe they're but it's what they're and it's for everybody to read. Whatever got to wake up to is we just more cognitive dissonance or whatever you call it of who we're up against and what it is becoming. Because that's one of the reasons why they are history, so that you don't learn from it and you repeat it. And that's one of the things, like, I've just gone full force through all kinds of history that you can think of.
Yeah.
And it is the same people at their doorstep. Someone directly from Venezuela came here and said exactly what happened there is happening here. They have to collect water out of trash cans. And it's crazy. And say that their values, and they may look similar, but what they're willing to do.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. You're very articulate. I want you to know that. And you've got a great grasp of the whole situation. So I think the Lord's going to use you to help wake people up. Two things, if I could. One is a concept called seizing the moral high ground. And casinos do this. If they come into an area, opponents will say, you're going to bring more drugs and sex trafficking, but if the casino gives a little money to schools, they can seize the moral high ground and say, we care about the children. And if you don't vote for the casinos, then you don't care about the children, and you're hateful and everything. And so what they do is they need to say, we care about people's health more than you do. And you have to give up all your freedoms because we care about their health and you don't care about their health, right? That's one thing. The other is early 1900s, you have Sears catalog, and they're marketing products. And then they noticed that if they can make products look like they're in and everybody's using them, more people buy them. And then you had 1938 radio drama, War of the Worlds, and H.G. Wells on the radio and says, New Jersey's being invaded by Martians, and it sweeps the country, and everybody's looking up at Martians in the sky. And so there's this phenomenon of getting it's called fear-mongering. And so now this got into marketing, or if you can market a product and put fear into people, and then you got Hitler, and you had his propaganda minister. Imagine having a business card, propaganda minister. And it was Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels. And he understood that people want to buy products that everybody else is buying, but also fit in view-wise. And so he would orchestrate these big events in coliseums with 100,000 people, and everybody at the front would start giving the Hitler salute, and it would work its way back, and everybody would see everybody else giving the Hitler salute, and they would feel pressure to give the Hitler salute. This group dynamic of pressure. So this was studied after World War II in America. It was called the Solomon Asch Conformity Experiment. And they did it on college campuses, where they would pull 8 students into a room. 7 had been paid ahead of time to be actors. 1 was a naive participant. And the teacher put 2 cards on the desk. One simply had 1 line on it, and the other had 3 lines, one shorter, one longer, one the same. One by one, the paid actors would stand up and convincingly say that the shorter line was equal to the other line. By the time it got around to the 8th naive participant, 30% of them would deny their own eyes to fit in with the group. And so this was studied and said, okay, we're not just going to use it in the classrooms and use it for behavior modification and say, okay, everybody's going to believe this, and if you don't, we're going to ridicule you. It got into online. And now everyone wants to be liked, and no one wants to be unfriended. And so they have Google, the #1 search engine in the world, has algorithms that pull up all the positive articles on one candidate, all the negative articles on the other candidate. The person doing the search wants to fit in with what everybody else is saying. And if they can sway just a small percentage of the vote, they can swing the election. And so it's interesting, this idea, little kids want to wear the same tennis shoes as everybody. The ladies read the fashion magazines because they want to wear what's in, and this group pressure. But yet Jesus calls us out of the group. He says, you have to love me more than your mother, sister, brother. Right? The word ecclesia, ek means out of, ecclesia means a calling out of the world, and the children of Israel called out of Egypt. And so the only way you can be free, it reminds me of that one picture where everyone's kneeling at in protest at the ball game, and there's one baseball player that stands up. And he says, I only kneel to Jesus. And but you can only have strength not to be pressured if you realize that someday you're going to be dead, and all that's going to matter is you're facing God. And with that thought, if you've been dead and you're in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross, paid for your sins, and you've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise than when we just begun. Imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years, walking streets of gold. Maybe you meet Moses. It'd be pretty cool, right? Maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. I don't know what it's like in heaven, but Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions, so I bet Moses will have a nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it, the burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, and the logs in his fireplace. I heard one preacher say, in heaven you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I'll say, I was thinking about something else. I don't know. But imagine being there in Moses' living room. He's sitting right in front of you. You reach over, tap him on the shoulder, and say, Moses, tell us the story again. I mean, I read the book. I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. The room gets quiet. Moses stands up, and he goes, I was 80 years old, and Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us with these razor-sharp swords, and we were totally unarmed. And I just stood there holding out my rod and staff and say, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. Then we're going to see David. Say, David, tell us your story. Room gets quiet. David stands up. I was just a teenager, and this thug Goliath was mocking our God. These grown-ups were too scared, and I said, enough of that. Take my sling and hit him in the head and chopped his head off. And one by one, they're all going to tell their stories. It's going to be really exciting. And then everybody in the room is going to look at you. So you tell us your story. We haven't heard from you yet. What was going on earth when it was your turn to be down there? Tell us what it was like when everybody was against you. Tell us how you stood up against all kinds of injustice, and what are you going to say? Right? I hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus to walk in and him have a big screen and show all kinds of great things happening, and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do, but you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life and you see that big mountain that held you back, that fear of man, what people would say, and it was just this little bitty anthill. You said, I let that little thing hold me back from doing all this great stuff. And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for the Lord because you're already in heaven, because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have breath in our lungs. You still can do those things you'll be known for forever. It's like a basketball game, and there's the bench, and you're sitting on it, and the coach comes over and slaps you on the back and says, your turn, get in the game. And you're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there, right? Yeah, I know. It's your turn, get in the game. It's like, but coach, somebody they just got knocked down. They're bleeding and everything. Yeah, I know. It's your turn. You're 7 feet tall. They are 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. So thank you.